Hello everyone, I just thought I'd make a quick introduction to using GradeScope and how to set up the software for marking of post-secondary exams and assignments. So just to start off, I'm logging in with my web ID from Western, and we're just going to start off by creating a new course for instructional purposes. So I'm just speeding through this bit here, but essentially just input all of your course numbers, course names, and course descriptions as you see fit. Your students will be able to see this, so I generally suggest that it be not necessarily instructive, but informative definitely. There's also a function that allows students to enroll in the course via a course entry code, but personally I don't like to do this, as generally your course rosters are already predefined by the time you make the GradeScope. So by all means you can follow along with the GradeScope tutorials and GradeScope things to do, but right here I'm just going to add in a student. You have a number of different options you can add: instructors, TAs, readers, or additional students. But in this particular case, I'm just going to be using my thesis advisor as an example. But it's also important to know that you can actually upload all of your students at once via a .csv file or an Excel file, which is going to be quite a bit more time conservative, especially if you have a number of different students to upload. But overall, regardless of what method you use, the outcome will be the same. So now that we've added an example student, we're just going to create an assignment. Now we have a number of options. You can create an exam and quiz, which is usually a fixed length, or a homework assignment or problem set. This is usually the function I use, regardless of if this is homework or if it's an exam or a lab or an essay. Now I've just found through experience that the homework and problem set settings tend to be a lot more compatible with post-secondary assignments. Now right here I'm just inputting the assignment name, and I'm going to skip over selecting a file to upload, but essentially you just want to ensure that whatever file you use as your template is only one page, and this is furthermore just to do with compatibility at a post-secondary level. Now generally through exams, if you're using some kind of school data system, you want to set your settings to instructor upload for obvious reasons. But just as we begin here, we're going to start off by creating a marking rubric. So on the left you can see here I've just got a really generic outline, and this will just act as a placeholder. Now you can create name and ID regions, but generally for exams I find that they're not particularly reliable, as they require a common format amongst all of your students' exams. But the main part here is really I'm splitting up my individual components of my exam into multiple choice, short answer, long answer, and a calculation-based question, so we can go through an example of each. Setting up the GradeScope marking rubric is a little bit different in each context. It's probably good to note here that there's a lot of temptation associated with splitting up your questions into individual questions. So, for short answer, question 1, 2, 3 through 5. But I would strongly advise against it, as essentially every time you toggle to a next question, for these variable length assignments, you're going to run into issues where GradeScope brings the PDF back to the cover page, which is a bit of a hassle if you're marking over 40, 50 assignments, as we generally do in post-secondary education. So right now I'm just normalizing where those question boxes really are with regards to the general layout of the exam. And this is just something that I've found through experience, is when you toggle to the next question, GradeScope will automatically bring you to where you've already placed those question boxes. So if you reduce the size of them, you'll consistently be zooming out and zooming in based on the assignment that you're marking. So right now I'm just going to be uploading a PDF, and it's also important to note that GradeScope will only accept PDF submissions, so by all means I would suggest that ensure that your students are only uploading PDF submissions. But in this particular case I'm uploading the example document so we can go through and begin to make a rubric within the grade submissions category right here, or tab right here. Now, I found that generally for assignments that are variable length, you generally want to grade them individually and not to form answer groups, as the answer groups rely on placement and location of your answers, which isn't particularly effective in the context of variable length assignments. So just as we move forward with the multiple choice example question, I've just found through experience that you generally want to create question groups for multiple choice of groups of 5. And this just really helps because of the hotkey functions associated with GradeScope. So by creating groups of 5, you can use the first 5 keys, Q, W, E, R, T, to essentially do all of your yes, no marking for multiple choice, or correct, incorrect marking for multiple choice, all with one hand. Now I've set scoring to positive for multiple choice just because your graders are going to be going individually, and it's much more intuitive to hit the hotkey based on a positive correlation between the answer and the student submission versus just hitting a hotkey based on incorrect answers. So right now I'm just going through a brief example of how your graders are really going to function. So by comparing the student response to the correct answer, you can just click on one of these, Q, W, E, R, T hotkeys after hitting, toggling 1 and 2 for each question group. And this allows you to really efficiently grade multiple choice in a relatively short amount of time. So you can see there, just if you're not using some kind of auto grading software, it only took me a number of seconds to grade, 10 multiple choice. So now that we move on to short answer, there are a number of different ways to mark these, but generally, just because, I mentioned earlier how when you toggle to your next question using a comma or period, it always removes you from the question and puts you back to the first page, especially for these variable length answers. So in this particular case, I like creating question groups for each question. So question 1 through 5 will have individual question groups, and if they're written, as you can see, what I'm putting in here is I put, exceeds expectations, and then I generally will like to put a description. And this is so if you're grading, 150 to 200 different students, your graders can establish, high levels of consistency even between graders, as it functionally provides a lot of guidance regardless of who's grading it if you provide relatively explicit information on what's expected for each of these criteria. After you finish up making your rubric for question 1, for example, you can see here I'm just making a question group for question 2. And similarly, if it's a written question, you can put in the same, exceeds expectations through unacceptable grading scheme. And similarly to in question 1, you can put in those very explicit criteria for marking. So even if you have multiple graders marking the same question, you're going to establish some kind of consistency across your student population. So I should probably explain my logic here. Now I have this particular question set up as a negative marking scheme, but you might actually find that when you're giving feedback to students, they seem a little bit confused when it comes down to, why they got deducted from meets expectations. So in this particular situation, under rubric settings, you might want to switch this to a positive marking scheme. So instead, a student will get 4 out of 5 for meets expectations, as opposed to -1 out of 5 or 5 minus 1 for a meets expectations mark. So now we kind of move along here. This is just an example for the long answers. So essentially, just because it's the one question, you can, of course, for something that's a reflection or an essay, have a standard exceeds expectations through unacceptable and missing as your method of grading these. However, I find that much of the time it's more useful to split the question up into constituent parts and then grade those individually, even kind of subgrouping into those same categories. So just to clarify what I meant when I said kind of grouping those into subgroupings, You can see here, maybe you have a section 1 of your long answer where you're discussing a specific concept, or where you expect a student to discuss a specific concept, in which case you can break it down by exceeds, meets, acceptable and unacceptable, similarly to as we were doing in the other example. Now, alternatively, dependent on the context of the question, or really what the question is asking, you may actually want to create a positive marking scheme where you assign marks based on individual expected, discussion topics. For, a very, I guess as an example that I'm doing right here, in the context of, load sharing and stress shielding and orthopedic implants, you may want to attribute marks to different sentences within the student's written answer. So this could include, the definition of stress shielding, maybe a discussion of stress shielding in the context of load sharing, and different individual components that you want your graders to look for. And once again, this is another very good way of establishing consistency, even if you have multiple graders grading the same question, which is unfortunately a lot of the time, something that you're going to have to deal with. So I'm sure you're, beginning to understand that really all of these settings within GradeScope can be very strategic and adapted to the specific question. So for example, right here, maybe I have a subgrouping where I really want to discuss the topic of load sharing, and then individually within that, I assume that students are going to have to discuss, moment sharing, force sharing, and maybe provide an example question so you can further, refine the mark contributions for these long answer questions. But this does come with a caveat, and that really is to make sure that you're not overcomplicating the marking guide. So if you have, multiple TAs that can mark, a very finite amount of these, then I'm sure it's fine to really have these subgroupings, because the more subgroupings, the more explicit guidance that you provide, the larger the consistency you'll have amongst your graders. However, for example, if you only have a few graders and you're not too worried about consistency because maybe, each individual TA is grading, all of, question 1, question 2, then you want to reduce the number of, individual breakdowns, because you're not as worried about consistency, but time is substantially increased every time that you need to hit one of these hotkeys. So it's really that inverse relationship between specificity in your rubric and in of course combination with how quickly you want the marking to be done. Okay, so now we're just going to move on to a calculation-based question where you need to show your work. On the left there, I just have an example from our 4469 Biomechanics Assignment 1. But essentially, as we move through here, I like to put in what, I like to call a marker cop-out. And this is generally just, you run to the end of the question, you look to see if it matches your 100% marking guide, and if the answers match or if the numbers match up, then you just have a general correct button. And that allows markers to move quickly through those submissions for long answer that are 100% correct. Now, in the case of correct answers, of course, you can also put in the comment up there what the actual correct answer is, as a little bit of a reminder, because before you publish these grades, before you submit the answers back to students, you can of course adapt these comments in the marking rubric after your TAs are all finished up using them. So as we move through here, generally what I like to find for these calculation-based questions is I'll mark a couple of them, and as I'm marking through them, I'll start to develop an understanding of what common errors might be. So in this particular question, it might be using incorrect trig functions, or doing the moment summation incorrectly. Now, in this particular long answer calculation-based question, we also have a little bit of a reflection as far as I believe that's 1C. And in this particular case, you can actually group that into an exceeds expectations, meets expectations, all through unacceptable or missing, in a similar way as we discussed in those earlier questions. And if you're doing this combination, I generally suggest that it be on a negative marking scale. And essentially it just means that, once your marker has gone through and read the little reflection at the bottom, it'll do that subtraction. And it might be a little bit more confusing for the students who get their marks back, but in this particular case, it just simplifies the question and allows you to have a global calculation-based question with those reflections, as opposed to designating a separate question just for the purposes of including that positive marking. Now, as you can see here, I guess it might be a little bit more of a stylistic thing, but I like to put in remarkably, explicit requirements for each, exceeds expectations, meets expectations, through, did not finish question. And this is just generally, not only for consistency between graders, but I find that, if I'm grading 100 assignments, I tend to do it in, spells with little breaks in between, and it allows you to maintain that consistency, even if you take a couple minutes off to make yourself a coffee or something. Then when you come back, you don't need to, put your head back in the marking zone necessarily, because you have all of the criteria really listed, specifically for each question. No, I actually think I miss it here, but at the very bottom of the column, you have the ability to provide comments specific to the submission and do individual point adjustments. So that's what I usually use if, say, someone's bordering on exceeds expectations and meets expectations. I like to, maybe assign them the meets expectations marks and then credit them, a half mark in addition and leave a comment down there. Or alternatively, I'll give them exceeds expectations, deduct half a mark, and just at the very bottom in that specific comments to this submission, just provide a little bit of guidance on why I removed the marks or what minor thing that the student could have improved upon. Now that's usually specific to individual students, and if you notice that you're encountering the same error over and over again, it's probably best just to add another rubric item so you're not retyping it out. Now I guess another good thing to note is for lab reports where you're requiring a lot of exceptional feedback, I actually really like to make sure that I use that comment box at the bottom to give really explicit feedback, so students can really understand what's going on. Now right here I'm just showing off what the marking guide ends up looking like, and you'll notice in that particular example, if you look back in the video, it showed all of the rubric items, which I don't want, because generally I find it confuses the students and you get a lot of arguments. So right there I highlighted the setting to show only applied rubric items. So now if I go back to download PDF, you can see all of the multiple choice are shown, so they get a very specific breakdown of that, and then they only get exceeds expectations through everything, as well as their individual comments specific to their submission. So I just find this provides the most clarity, and then you don't get as many emails afterwards. So it's a good balance between providing as much feedback as is possible while still not confusing students. And of course it includes their submission at the bottom there. It's also probably important to note that when you do have a show only rubric or applied rubric items option selected, it'll actually show all of the positive scoring rubric items required, so that's why it works well for multiple choice. But for something where you don't want to specifically tell the student what would be required for exceeds expectations through unacceptable, because then sometimes you get quite a bit of argument, just make sure that's on a negative scoring scale. So you might have questions about, hey, I don't understand why I got deducted here because I got meets expectations, but you won't run into those issues where students are arguing with you based on your definition of meets versus exceeds expectations. So this mostly wraps up our brief introduction to some strategies I might find remarkably helpful when you're setting up GradeScope marking. Now, this is an incredibly powerful tool, but I do think that, there is some benefit to having some consistency, as a lot of these tips and tricks are experience-based, and especially during my own learning curve, I was, vastly overwhelmed by the, potential methods of going about marking and setting up the questions. So from this perspective, I believe there is some merit in having a little bit more cross-communication and openness about different marking strategies. So for those of you going into final season for marking, I wish you the best of luck. And for those of you, watching a little bit further in the future, it is definitely worth playing around with GradeScope, developing your own marking strategies, and then sharing those with others, because a lot of this could be, learned through the diffusion of our own, or the distribution of our own innovations using GradeScope.